all around them.
My name is Sean Smith. I'm with the Sustainability Solutions Initiative, and we're very lucky today to have Dr. Robert Jacobson. Just a show of hands, how many were here for the first lecture? That's SSI data for populations that come to see different talks.
Take our names down.
Yeah, keeping track. This portion of the seminar series is co-sponsored by SSI and the Department of Earth Sciences, and we're very fortunate to have Dr. Robert Jacobson here with us. And Dr. Robert Jacobson is a supervisory research hydrologist with the USGS at the Columbia Environmental Research Center in Missouri. And he had a doctorate received from the Department of Geography and Environmental Engineering at Johns Hopkins University, and has been involved with many panels, boards, and so forth all across the country for ecological issues, National Science Foundation projects, federal agency initiatives, associate editor for water resources research, the list goes on, a strong list of publications, and has a lot of involvement with as a national leader in watershed management and restoration projects on very large scales. And we're fortunate for several reasons. One is that his talk this morning talked about conceptualization and communication of ecological river restoration. It closely relates to SSI's involvement in projects around the state of Maine. And we're in the midst of big changes on the Penobscot River with the dam removals and the ecological focus on fisheries populations there. And Rob's been immersed in all these topics. And I think aside from his publications and his credentials, he also was brave enough to take 3 flights and make 4 stops at airports, some of which are fairly small, including Bangor, to get here in midwinter, and he's here, and we've had a wonderful week, and here's his second talk today.
Thanks very much, Sean, and thanks to the Sustainability Solutions Initiative, the Department of Sciences, NSF, also David Hart for the invitation to come and give these talks. With the snow that's coming tomorrow, the question is, will I get home? Many of you read the talk this morning. This is going to actually add a little bit of meat to the bones to some of these issues. It's not going to answer a lot of these questions because that's the nature of things. And I have this emphasis here on a long, strange trip as we start to understand that more as we go through. The story of essentially of how science is applied to the management goals of restoring what is actually a very large river. So what I want to stress is, and I alluded to these things in the earlier talk, and it's probably worth repeating, the importance of knowing your river system, knowing the geography, knowing the history of the river. The importance of careful diagnosis of what is wrong with the system, not based on what you think is wrong with the system, but what really is, especially if the intent is to engineer a specific response to the management or restoration effort. And consistent with my talk this morning, the importance of understanding the social political context and how science fits within that context. And the point there is that all the science we do in this large river system with lots of stakeholders involved, all the science is negotiated. There's no ivory tower science being done. And sometimes, in fact, the science is negotiated in a way that we don't think is all that useful, but we still move forward year by year, and eventually, hopefully, make some progress. I also want to sort of set this up as a dichotomy between 2 broad endpoints of river restoration and management. I put these down as a natural flow paradigm. It's in the pioneering paper by Roy Hoffman. And then another paper that right now I can't remember where it came out in. The name of it was Can Large Rivers Be Restored? By Jim Gore and Doug Shields in 1995. And they set up sort of this paradigm that we struggle with on the Missouri River. The natural flow paradigm states that river ecosystems, biota habitats, are all adjusted to and require flow variation. Therefore, restoring the hydrograph and sediment that is assumed to go along with that is necessary and usually a sufficient condition to restore the river. And this has been adopted by many people in the aquatic ecosystem community. And my interpretation of that, is some of the discussion we had this morning, is that river ecosystems are so complex, we actually are not smart enough to try to engineer them. That is, we have to restore the hydrograph and hope it does the right thing. It's a more holistic restoration approach to river restoration. And that's legitimate and can work on smaller rivers, but as you get into larger rivers, the society expects more from them, we're into a different paradigm, the idea of the progressive engineering that Gordon Shields talked about. And they start with the premise of the understanding that human social and economic uses are part of the riverine ecosystem. And that in highly managed systems, altered systems, morphology, habitat, water quality, and the parameters are frequently not adjusted to the flow regime. So we can't look at one simple master variable, flow regime being the controller. The implication is that we must be smart enough to engineer some sort of socially acceptable optimum that provides ecosystem services, ecological benefits, as well as socio-economic benefits. And this is more in the line of the designer ecosystem concept. And in a larger like Missouri, we're definitely in that part of the continuum. However, a lot of the history of management of the river has been tied up with the natural flow paradigm. Go into that later. The first geography, like I said, it's really important to understand the river system. This is a very large river. It covers 1/6 of the United States. It's over 3,700 kilometers long. It's got a lot of relief that goes from St. Louis down here, where it enters the Mississippi River, all the way up to the top of the Rockies in Montana. When we study the Missouri River, we kind of cookie cutter out that basin and say this is what we're studying. And in some ways that's an oversimplification because things that happen in the Missouri River are connected to other parts of the continent and to the globe. One of the prominent examples of that is that sediment produced in the Missouri River is no longer being transported to the Gulf of Mexico. Nutrients that are produced in the Missouri River are being transported to the Gulf of Mexico. So we're really connected with them. And then through teleconnections of economy, power network, power grid, and things like that, we're connected to hydropower policy decisions in the Columbia River, and we're connected to the price of soybeans in Brazil. So it is a simplification to say we can just look at the Missouri River. I'm going to make that simplification and actually get even finer later on. Critical thing about the Missouri River, I live down here in the part of the Missouri River that is pretty darn wet. Precipitation map of the United States. You see that most of the basin is dominated by flows that are less than 500 millimeters a year. The important thing is that the Missouri River, despite the fact that most of the population is down here and thinks of it as a fairly wet river, this is a western river. It's a dry river. And it has all the problems of a western river, as Mark Twain alluded to. I actually haven't been able to document that he said this, but he should have said this. In 1884, he was out west and he was a reporter in Nevada. And so people say he said this, but it's a great quote. And it really epitomizes Missouri River politics. It is about the water, and there's a tremendous amount of contention about that. That's a problem you have in different ways here in the East. I mean, some places in the East, the Atlanta metro area, for example, water quantity is becoming important. But in a lot of places in the East, it's water quality that's more important. In Western rivers, quantity is the big issue. In this map, I've outlined the annual precipitation that's between 200 and 500 millimeters of annual precipitation. And I did this because all of the factors being equal, this is the precipitation that results in the highest sediment yield. That is, you have enough water that you can transport sediment, but you don't have so much water that you have a lot of lush vegetation. And you can see most of the basin of the Missouri River is dominated by that, and as a result, the Missouri River Basin has always been a sediment-producing machine. As far as cultural geography of the Missouri River, it's got parts of 10 states, 2 countries. We've got a little sliver of Canada right up the top there. It has 28 Native American tribes. Most of those tribes have senior water rights and have not adjudicated their water rights. In the riparian West, that means that they control the water, which is perceived as quite a threat to people's downstream. It has 10 million people in the basin, which if you look at it, in terms of the size of the basin, that density isn't that great. The problem, as I see it, is that there are 10 million very opinionated people, and many of them feel like they have a lot to say about how the Missouri River is operated. Missouri River hydrology is dominated, in addition to snowmelt hydrology in the Great Plains. It's also dominated by this alteration of the system, main stem dams. There are 6 main stem dams that are operated by the Corps of Engineers up to Fort Peck in Montana, and the Canyon Fury Dam and a lot of other little smaller dams are operated by the Bureau of Reclamation. But the 6 core reservoirs altogether create the largest reservoir system in North America. This is 91 cubic kilometers of storage, but if you don't think in terms of cubic kilometers, you can think of it in terms of million acre feet, 75 million acre feet. And in an average year, it'll generate about 10 billion kilowatt hours of power. And most of that power is peaking power. So they're able to use it for peak load demand. And so on the spot market, it's worth quite a bit of money. That's marketed through the Western Area Power Administration. Now, 10 billion kilowatt hours is about 1.5 nuclear power plants, so it's not a lot, but because it's peaking, it's pretty useful power, and as far as the power grid goes. And of course, those dams have had an effect on the system. I'm going to show you how it's affected the hydrology of the system, consistent with the idea that if you're going to look at how a river system operates ecologically, you need to look at the flow regime. We start upstream at Wolf Point, which is downstream from the upstreammost dam at Fort Peck. And I'm going to show a bunch of these diagrams. These diagrams come from a routing model that the Corps of Engineers uses for all of their planning in the Missouri River. They have 104 years of daily inflows to the system. And then they can operate the reservoirs however they want to. They just change the model. And so you can run that model with the reservoirs completely full of water and create the natural hydrograph. The natural hydrograph is shown here in gray. And the banding is for each day of the year. It's the difference between the 75% exceedance and the 25% exceedance. So it's the interquartile range. So it gives you an idea of over 100 years on that day of the year, that time of the season, how much variability there is. And then across the season, you can see the seasonal variability of flows. And so here, at one point, you can see what the reservoir does, which is mostly the reservoirs. They're operated for power supply and flood control and recreation and a variety of other things. But the main thing in terms of flood control and power generation is taking the peaks off the hydrograph, and it's very good at doing that. And then you can see that in the fall, a lot of years the flows go up because the reservoirs have to be evacuated for more flood control volume. It's a very altered hydrograph in that area. Interestingly, if you go down to Williston, North Dakota, which is just downstream where the Yellowstone comes in, the natural hydrograph and the regulated hydrograph look very different. You notice the difference here, the top of the graph is 100 cubic feet per second, and and at Wolf Point it was 40 cubic feet per second. So we've increased the flow quite a bit. And the reason that the hydrograph looks so nice here is that the Yellowstone River is coming in. And the Yellowstone River is the least altered flow regime in North America, especially for a river that size. It has very few flood control reservoirs with substantial storage in it. And so for a very short, at about 30 miles from the confluence down to the headwaters of Lake Sakakawea, there's a really nice flow regime. But it's a very short piece of the river, unfortunately. Get down to Bismarck, we see the same very high alteration of the flow regime. I am going to spend, there's lots of issues about the upper river, but I'm going to spend the rest of this talk talking about the lower river. That is downstream of the downstreammost dam, which is at Yankton, South Dakota. It's about 70 miles upstream from Sioux City, Iowa. This is the hydrograph in Sioux City, Iowa. Here things have changed quite a bit. There's a lot less interannual variability. Those bands have become finer. You see in the natural hydrograph, there are two distinct peaks to it. There's an interesting thing about the Missouri River, and one of the things that perplexes us, whether the separate peaks under the natural system would have had separate ecological functions. But what this means physically is that first peak is the result of snowmelt on the Great Plains. The second peak is snowmelt from the Rocky Mountains. And they may have done different things in this river system under natural conditions. But on the regulated hydrograph, you can see things have changed quite a bit. And what's happened here is that flows are brought up at the end of March, so that April 1st, it starts navigation season. Because now, the whole system is used in addition to power generation and flood control of the water supply. It's also used to support navigation flows. And navigation flows require very steady flows through the navigation season. Some years there is some evacuation in the fall. And so instead of getting spring floods, we get fall floods. So This has been referred to as the death of the Missouri River by one of my colleagues, saying that this is the heartbeat that has been stilled. And as a result, a lot of the emphasis in restoring the river early on was at looking at changing that flow regime. However, as we move downstream and some other tributaries come in, so we're looking here down at Kansas City, we can see that the flow regime recovers some of that variability. It's not a natural flow regime. The peaks are still cut off down further in the system, and flows are still held unnaturally high in the fall to float barges downstream. But there's a lot of variability that's recovered, and one of the residual questions we continue to struggle with on the Missouri River is if the flow regime is pretty good down here, do we have to recover the entire river? Because it's a lot easier to work with the flow regime downstream than it is upstream. How much of the river really needs to be restored? I also want to talk a little bit about an interesting fact of the Missouri River geography that relates to the species that are concerned on the Missouri River. There's a short piece of the Missouri River from Gavin's Point down at Yankton, down to just a little bit upstream of Sioux City, that looks like this. This is actually a spot image that came from November of this year. And this year we had a quote-unquote 500-year flood in this part of the river. Usually it doesn't look this complex. It was really strongly affected this year, and a lot of sandbars were deposited. And one of the ongoing questions is what's going to happen to those sandbars. These sandbars in this short piece of the river that's unchannelized, these sandbars are critical habitat for the piping plover and the least tern. And the Corps of Engineers have spent millions of dollars over the years of dredging sand and building sandbars mechanically. This year they got about 9,000 acres of those sandbars created by this extreme flood. But most of the river, from Sioux City, Iowa, all the way down to St. Louis, looks more like this. It's a narrow, single-thread meandering stream, and that is not natural. That is the effect of channelization of the river. And so when we look at restoration of the river, we're kind of stuck with this geographic dichotomy. A really nice-looking channel morphology up here, lots of complexity, and an extremely altered hydrograph. Then as you go further downstream, all this extremely altered morphology, but a better hydrograph. And how can restoration work within that to optimize how the system works for whatever restoration objectives? Another big factor that's been changed on the Missouri River is the sediment supply. This is a sort of famous diagram that came from my colleague Bob Mead, where he was looking at the water quality of the entire Mississippi River basin. And he likes to put these together in what he calls arteriograms. So this is the network of the upper Mississippi, the Mississippi above the Gulf of Mexico. And the width is proportional to the sediment load. And he has here the best estimate of what it looked like at European settlement. And what it shows is that naturally the Missouri River dominated the sediment load of the whole Mississippi River basin. And if we look at it today, you can see how the Missouri River has necked down and decreased the sediment load quite a bit. The Ohio River is actually increasing more now because of land use effects in the Ohio River basin, etc. But the Missouri River has always been the biggest contributor of sediment to the Gulf of Mexico. And it contributes much less now. That reservoir system has disrupted the flow of sediment through the system, and it's created problems or perceptions of problems in different areas. So building large deltas in the reservoirs. And for people who used to have a marina that was used for water skiing, this is a very bad thing. For duck hunters, this is a great thing. But all that sediment is being stored in the system, and downstream there is a dearth of that sediment. We recently worked on a paper to go back and evaluate and put the best estimates possible on those sediment loads. So moving from upstream to downstream, these are the sediment loads averaged over this 12-year period in millions of tons per year. Basically zero right near the dam to 55 million tons a year now. Historically, these are the best data we could come up with, 121 million to 326 million tons a year suspended sediment, not including dead load. And so at the bottom of the system, the river only has about 17% of the sediment that it used to have. This is one of the biggest constraints on all restoration of the Missouri River because the Missouri River dams were never designed to pass sediment. And to get them to pass sediment is a very expensive and very difficult thing. One of the implications of that is that with the lack of sediment, the channel has adjusted downstream. It's been channelized but also adjusted because of the lack of sediment. In green, this shows a change in elevation of 75% flow exceedance over about the 6-year time frame. The dam is here upstream, and this is St. Louis down here. And downstream of the dam, you can see that over just about a 6-year time frame, there's been a meter of incision. As you go downstream, Omaha, Nebraska is about here. St. Joe, Missouri is about in here. This is the area that's actually aggrading. Then there's another big area of degradation near Kansas City. Very controversial because channel degradation has left the water supply intakes at a high level. Barges can't fit through here at some discharges now. Very, very expensive thing to adjust for this. And some people hold that this is a result of sand mining from the channel, and others say that it's a result of channelization. But in any case, this part here is almost certainly the result of lack of sediment coming out of the dam, which is now being deposited down here. And that has an effect on, among other things, restoration potential of wetlands. I'm not going to talk about that. We have a paper published in Wetlands Ecology and Management where we make the case that this pattern of incision, based on then on where the larger rivers come in, determine where the best places are to manage wetlands on the system. And then the other big factor in the Missouri River Basin has been the process of channelization itself. Anybody who ever gives a talk on the Missouri River always shows these same slides. So if you ever see another Missouri River talk, I can almost guarantee you'll see these. This is great photo documentation that was done by the Corps of Engineers at a place in Nebraska, showing what the river looked like even as late as 1934. And there were steamboats on this river a century earlier than that, and there had been a lot of alteration of the system. But even in 1934, most of the river looked like this. Multiple channels, big sandbars, lots of eroding cutbanks, a very, very dynamic and complex environment. A lot of this was narrowed down as a result of various authorizations through time, but the big one was the Flood Control Act of 1944. But it used about the same technology. Put pile dikes out into the river, willow mats, and it trapped the sediment. And by the time 1977 comes along, all this land has been accreted. And then, in all states except Iowa, this land became the property of the adjacent landowner. It was created for them by the federal government. And because there were no regulatory controls, they could build levees right along the bank. So the river had really narrowed down, and so now the top width of the river at median discharge is about 25% of what it was naturally. So channelization has had a really big effect on the system. Corps of Engineers did sort of accounting. We look at that sandbar and water habitat I showed in those photographs. They've lost 404 square kilometers of that. Low-lying terrestrial land, 274 square kilometers. And then the meander belt up on the floodplain that's now been levied off, 1,400 square kilometers. So this is what has been lost, and the restoration goal is to replace about 20% of that right now, which equates to about, I'm just going to talk right now about the aquatic habitat, but that aquatic habitat amounts to about 20 to 30 acres per mile that they're trying to restore to get to about 20% of what used to be there. Now, all this change in the system has been done because of the social economic benefits. This is an accounting of the social economic benefits based on what's called the National Economic Development Protocol. And I just point that out because economists will argue up and down about these numbers. This is a protocol that's at least internally consistent. Many people say that this number is a really low-ball estimate of the total economic benefits of the system, $1.7 billion a year. But the relative contribution of these different authorized purposes is probably pretty straightforward. Hydropower is the greatest part of it. Water supply is next. Flood control is next. And those are all very large numbers. And after that comes recreation. And recreation is reservoir recreation, not river recreation. Because in terms of dollars, there's very little on the river itself. And $7 million a year for navigation. The navigation industry will argue bitterly that this number is way low, but it's consistent with the way these other numbers have been calculated for comparison. And the river is also supposed to be managed for fish and wildlife, but without any dollar values associated with that. And because it's a federal entity and has to abide by the Endangered Species Act, it has to be managed to at least not put threatened endangered species in jeopardy. What effect has all this had on the biological system? There are darn few data sets we can point to that document biological changes in the Missouri River. This is one of them, and it still requires a fair amount of inference. This is total commercial harvest in the state of Missouri off the Missouri River. You can see sharp decline when the dams were completed about 1950. So the inference is that those dams had something to do with this. Well, then there's a sharp increase here in 1990, but this is attributed to the fact that there were wild rumors that the Department of Conservation was going to close the commercial catfish fishery. And then they did close it in 1992, and of course it went down quite a bit. But this is the kind of data set that's used to say, okay, everything that's been done in the river system has had an impact on the native fishery resources. We know at this point 24 native fishes in decline, 5 are globally imperiled. There's 11 native fishes that are listed by the states, and we have 1 federal endangered species that I'm going to be talking about quite a bit. But my point here is that this isn't the best data set for trying to show association, and it does very little to tell us what cause and effect is. And so when the agencies have gone into restoration mode, they've said, aha, something happened here in relation to the dam. It has to be the dams are responsible, and there's a lot of inference about how that responsibility took place. Now, there's been a lot of native species apparently affected by this, but the leverage, the overwhelming leverage for recovery of the Missouri River has been based on the Endangered Species Act and these 3 species: interior least tern, piping plover. These are birds that nest on sandbars, and that seems to be their limiting and critical habitat. And then the pallid sturgeon. This is a big fish that lives at the bottom of the river. What's interesting to me, by the way, is that in the way that the science gets worked into management is because you can see and count and enumerate nesting success of these birds. There's a lot of this science has been used directly in making management decisions, much more so than the pallid sturgeon. It's much more difficult to develop the information that can be used to make arguments for either recovery or continued decline of the pallid sturgeon. Birds are just easier. Although if you talk to the avian ecologists, they say no, it's not true. This is going to be a long, complicated slide. I hope you don't fall asleep to it. But it's sort of my motivation for using that subtitle of A Long Strange Trip. And this gets at one of the questions that came up earlier this morning about why are you doing it that way? And the response was, I'm not doing it, and it's a result of the history and the sequence of events. So I'm going to go through a timeline of management here, starting with Lewis and Clark explored the Missouri River in 1803. And we have a bit of a gap in there. The Pick-Sloan Plan, which is the Flood Control Act of 1944 that authorized the main stem reservoirs and the Bank Stabilization Navigation Project. The reservoirs were filled, the dams completed, the reservoirs filled in 1967. The Bank Stabilization Navigation Project, to do all that channelization, that wasn't finished until 1981. In 1981, that was all done, and almost immediately the Fish and Wildlife Service came back and said, you know what? Interior least tern is endangered and piping plover is threatened. That was followed very shortly by the Corps of Engineers saying, uh-oh, we messed up a lot of habitat, and we're going to authorize a program to mitigate that habitat. So that started in 1986. We had a big drought that began in 1987. And because of that drought, the upstream states got very, very upset with the way the river was being operated. They required the Corps of Engineers to go back to the drawing board and redo the master manual that they used. This was a master manual study to address the fact that during these droughts there wasn't enough water left in the upper part of the system. Shortly after that, the pallid sturgeon was listed. It's like piling on difficulties to the management of the river system. The drought ended in 1992, but it was followed almost immediately by a period of high water, including the Great Flood of 1993. In the lower part of the Missouri River, the Great Flood of 1993 was a greater than 500-year event. 750,000 CFS peak flows, broke thousands of levees, flooded most of the valley bottom from bluff to bluff. And the result of that was that this draft environmental impact statement came out, this master manual study. It was based on dealing with droughts right after the flood in 1993, and it was done on arrival. So you guys got this all wrong. You've got to go back to the drawing board again. So I went back to the drawing board and came up with this is the first time I've ever seen one of these, a preliminary revised draft EIS. They're also not done on arrival. But they sweetened it by going to Congress and saying, we're going to authorize this program, we're going to expand it to a total of $1.3 billion that is going to recover 32% of the total habitat loss on the system. But here was the big hammer. This is the biological opinion that the Fish and Wildlife Service filed in 2000. And those of you who are not familiar with biological opinions, this is the document that enforces the Endangered Species Act. And these were jeopardy opinions saying that the way the Corps of Engineers is operating the system, the way they've said it's going to be operated by these EISs, puts the two terns, the Pallas sturgeon, and also the bald eagle all in jeopardy. And they said, you have to restore flow variability to the system, and you have to create 20 to 30 acres per mile of shallow water habitat. This is the document that stated that, and has been extremely influential in Missouri River history. Then moving on, the Corps said, you know, there's a lot about this biological opinion we don't agree with. So then they published their revised draft EIS without a preferred alternative, and they said, all the stuff we don't agree with, we're going to get together and we're going to resolve it through adaptive management. The miracle of adaptive management. The drought, another drought begins in 2000. There was an amended biological opinion, and this is where good biological data on the terns and plovers were enough that they amended it and took them off of a jeopardy opinion. But there's still a jeopardy opinion for the Pallas sturgeon and stronger requirements to change the hydrograph and create habitat. So the Corps, this is their final master manual that came out in 2004, record of decision, and they said, we're going to resolve some of these issues, especially about how to do flow variability, by engaging in adaptive management. The first adaptive management exercise in the river was a series of meetings I participated in the spring of 2005, when a bunch of people got together to design this alternative flow regime. That alternative flow regime was implemented with pulse tests in 2006, 2008, and 2009. We also went into another period of high water in 2007, and in the Water Resource Development Act of 2007, these two groups were authorized. This first one was the Mr. Rick, we call it, Missouri River Recovery Implementation Committee. This is the stakeholders group that brings everybody together to provide a formalized way to do this adaptive management. Mr. Earp is the Missouri River Ecological Restoration Program planning. The Corps, the service, and a variety of other stakeholders said, all of this management based on the biological opinion in 3 species isn't what we want. We want ecological restoration of the river. And so let's have a study to figure out how to do that. That was instituted in 2007. There was also a study instituted in 2009, which was to go back to the Flood Control Act in 1944 and see whether that needs to be revised. We've talked about surprises. Some of the surprises that came up were that 2010, that study was defunded by Congress. And that was purely political. The downstream states said, no, we don't want to have any part of this. Put through by the upstream states, the downstream states were going to kill it. And the other big surprise, the Great Flood of 2011, another 500-year flood that affected a different part of the river, and that killed the environmental restoration program. And the reason was that the downstream states said, how can you spend millions of dollars on ecological restoration and ignore flood control? And so we're back right now to restoration that, again, is based on 3 species. So why did I go through all that? It's to make the point that history of policy, politics, and regulation has determined for us the framework and opportunities and constraints for restoration and for science on the river. And because of that history, this is the excuse for why things look the way they do. It may not seem rational that we're doing what we're doing, but it's that history that has pushed this in there. In particular, that biological opinion in 2000 and as it was amended in 2003, put all this variability on nationalizing the flow regime. That's the power of the natural flow regime paradigm. And if you ever wonder about an article like Leroy Falk and others, 1997, this has been an extremely powerful piece of paper, at least in the Missouri River Basin, and I know a lot of other places as well. And they also said you've got to turn it back into more of what it looked like, the complexity of the natural channel. And that has been the guiding leverage on lots of stuff that's being done in the Missouri River, almost all of it. And so we negotiated the science effort to address primarily those two issues, flow regime and channel form. Now, as a geomorphologist, I'm sort of naturally predispositioned to think that geomorphic form and flow regime are the master variables, so I'm pretty happy with that. My colleagues say, you know, this is really limited. There's all these other potential stressors on the system. And yet, everything is geomorphic form and flow regime. In the science we do, we have a little bit of extra money coming in from other places, but mostly what we do is science that's driven by biological opinion compliance. And so we're working on these two stressors. But we also keep our eyes open. We do a lot of work on contaminants and nutrients and other stuff as well, getting more into genetics, et cetera. So we're not doing this with blinders on. But most of the money is going into these two stressors. And one of the reasons for that is, well, a couple of reasons. One is that historically we know these two things really changed a lot. And the inference is, therefore, those are the stressors that affected these species. The other thing is that these are the two things controlled by the Corps of Engineers. These things are controlled by a whole host of other people, you know, all through the basin, a very diffuse responsibility, whereas these rest with one agency. So I'm going to start first talking about the flow regime management, the design process that we went through in 2005 and how it failed, and then how we pursued science to try to address those sorts of issues. So here we are. Here's the natural hydrograph, and there's the regulated hydrograph of the Missouri River. The biological opinion in 2000 and 2003 was very, very specific. You have to turn it back into this. Not recovering all of the flow variability, but some elements of flow variability. And one of the interesting things here, well, let me start with the hypotheses. The hypotheses are that these peaks were important to do these things. Building sandbars to turn into plumbers, connecting the floodplain, nutrient exchange, opportunities for floodplain spawners to get up to the floodplain, and as a spawning cue for the pallid sturgeon. They also wanted to recover some of the summer low flows in order to expose the sandbars and provide for some of the shallow water habitat. And one of the interesting things about this is you notice that this second peak in the hydrograph that the Fish and Wildlife Service proposed is quite a bit earlier than the natural peak was. And this was an attempt to try to do a little bit better than nature, because the terns and flutters get here in the upper river to nest on sandbars in late May, so that in a number of years under the natural system, these birds would be flooded off the sandbars. And so in trying to engineer the hydrograph to do a little bit better than that, they wanted to have this peak happen a little bit earlier in the year. So that's one of the reasons that that's there. And then there was a negotiation in 2005 about elements of the hydrograph. The Corps of Engineers argued very carefully to take this low flow off the hydrograph. You see how it dips below navigation flows. The navigation industry said this is a killer for the industry. We can't have a split navigation season where we can navigate early in spring and then late in the fall. So the Corps of Engineers argued that we're going to take care of this and create shallow water habitat, not by changing the flow regime, but by changing how the water is distributed in the channel. We're going to create shallow water habitat using big yellow machines and diesel fuel. They also argued that spring pulses that are big enough to build sandbars and connect the floodplain violate their flood control mandate. So they argued this off the table as well. And what we ended up with was designing a flow regime based on a spawning cue for the pallid sturgeon. In 2005, nobody had observed spawning of the pallid sturgeon in the wild. So nobody really knew what conditions were necessary to have a spawning cue for the pallid sturgeon. So the logic that went into the design was the natural flow regime. Let's get a more natural flow responsible for this. This has been there's a paper that I wrote with my colleague David Galot where we talk about the technical aspects of going through the design, but it doesn't cover some of the institutional prospects. But here's what we had in 2005. That's what the Fish and Wildlife Service prescribed, and these are the alternatives that all these stakeholders came together to do. They used natural flow pulses to say, well, here's a better shape. And they said, well, we're going to try and recover anywhere between 10 and 25% of those natural flow pulses. They kept the flow pulses relatively early in the year so they wouldn't interfere with nesting and the terns and plovers. And, in fact, if they used a more natural shape, they actually saved water. So many people were very optimistic through this process, but in the end, they're running by consensus rules. All the stakeholders did not agree, and the entire process failed at the end of the summer. The Fish and Wildlife Service and the Corps of Engineers then went back into their own room together, and they said, we're going to take some of those ideas, and we're going to come up with a new alternative to the hydrograph, which is shown in black here, that's going to have somewhat smaller peaks, and move this peak even earlier in the spring so it interferes less with the terns and plovers. And that became what went into the environmental impact statement and the master manual, and it is actually still in there. And the first time it was implemented was in 2006. This was not a spring rise because there were no boats on the system and the criteria weren't met. So they didn't do, no, I'm sorry, the criteria weren't met here because there was some downstream flooding, so there's no spring rise here. And then the flows were decreased because there were no boats on the system. And then they increased the flow by this amount later on in April, late April, and called that the spring rise, starting from a lower baseline. And then they went into the sawtooth pattern, which is for tern and plover management, pumping flows up and down on a daily basis to encourage the birds to nest higher up on the sandbar. The Fish and Wildlife Service said, victory, we now have a naturalized flow regime on the Missouri River. And I'm being a little bit facetious there, but on one hand, it is a victory in that there was a stakeholder-guided effort that came up with an alternative flow regime the Corps of Engineers really didn't want to do. But this is a very small signal. What we were charged with evaluating how effective this was, and for us, this was a very small signal in a very noisy system. And as you can see, this is very, very small compared to the natural. But this is what has been the result of naturalization of the flow regime on the Missouri River. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we went to the science of evaluating how well that worked, but I also want to talk a little bit about some of the low-hanging fruit. So then this is part of that know your river sort of thing. So the question came up, so you're going to naturalize the flow regime, but is there any spawning substrate there? So we just did a reconnaissance throughout the entire river. And in fact, despite the fact this is a sand bed river, we found a lot of potential spawning substrates. We didn't think spawning substrate was going to be a limiting factor, although there are different kinds of substrate in different parts of the river, and so there might have been a preference for one or the other. We did a lot of habitat work to see whether there's habitat diversity and how sensitive that habitat was to the flow regime. We found that the fish are using these migratory pathways and optimizing low velocity areas. And we could look at the habitats that the adult fish were using, but it was hard to develop the understanding that any of these habitats might be a constraint on the reproduction of the fish. We looked at how sensitive the habitats were to flow pulses by doing a variety of hydraulic models, and we found that most habitats were totally insensitive to those flow pulses. They just weren't big enough. Especially the habitats we thought at that point were likely to be spawning habitat. Given at that point, this is 2007, 2008, we still hadn't really seen fish. We weren't sure where the fish were spawning. Subsequently, we found that pallid sturgeon were spawning on outside revetted banks. They would come up the inside, they'd migrate up the inside bends, but when it came time to spawn, they would go to the fastest, deepest, most turbulent part of the river and spawn on a riprap. The Corps of Engineers has installed 735 miles of riprap in the river. So at this point, we do not believe that spawning habitat, selling substrate or habitat with the flows in there, is a limiting factor. Another argument, another hypothesis has come up though, and that is that there's too much of this habitat. That there used to be only a few places along the river, and so those species, that population would aggregate in a few species in a few places. But now that's all spread out. It's like going downtown and trying to find a bar to pick up man or woman, and there are so many bars you can't find anybody to mate with. And so that's one of the hypotheses that's out there. We also had a question about whether these flows could transport sediment and condition that substrate. And what we found is that this is like standard geomorphology. We found the bed is extremely dynamic. We went out to lots and lots of surveying. Any flow pulse is capable of transporting sand and cleaning off substrate. But the question was still there, is in the right time, the right place, it really matters to a pallisergent. So we went into this iterative loop that really defines most of our science effort. And we can encapsulate this as the follow the fish approach. And we can do a lot of great geomorphology, but eventually we have to demonstrate its relevance to the fish. And so this is the approach that my group works. Extensive telemetry, both the shovel-nosed sturgeon and pallisergent. And we use acoustic tags because the conductivity in the river is too high. We can't use radio telemetry. And this is a little bit more time intensive because now we have to run crews down the river listening for pings and decoding those pings rather than maybe even using helicopters. We also put data storage tags in these fish to collect depth and temperature data. So we have an experimental matrix, or quasi-experimental matrix, that's based on an upstream and downstream thing. I'll kind of show you how this works out. Red and yellow here are water temperature, and this is just a diagram for 2010, where the yellow is the downstream temperature and red is upstream. The upstream part is where we're working upstream of the Platte River, downstream is downstream near Boonville, Missouri. So this is several hundred miles apart. And we have populations of fish tagged in both of those areas. And the experimental design is that up near the dam, which is shown in blue here, a little bit further down, it's a very controlled hydrograph, so very few flow pulses, except in years when we get a managed flow pulse out of the dam, where we could argue we actually have an experiment. So we could actually have experimental flows here, versus downstream, where there are substantial flow pulses, and sometimes multiple flow pulses, every year. This has its own experimental complications, because essentially what we're trying to do is match up fish behavior with the flow pulse. And we've got lots of pulses, it becomes harder to understand what the fish is responding to. This is what it looks like. We've got 2011 in the graph too, but I haven't put it up here. And if you look at this, just sort of broadly, you see that there's a lot of within year and among year variability, which means we have a lot of dynamic range on our experiment. We have very, very little replicability. And I think it's just natural in a kind of system we're trying to work with. Some years like 2006, a drought year throughout the entire river system. Some years like 2010, 2008, especially on the lower river, big floods that came through. I'll draw your attention to these circles. These circles are the pulsed flows out of Gavin's Point Dam in those years. Again, very, very small, even upstream, not the upstream, but very small compared to the pulses that are downstream. But with our upstream-downstream sample design, we can look at fish responses in both of those areas. And I'm not going to go exhaustively through the data, I'm just going to give you an idea of the kind of data we have, and then skip to where we are in our state of knowledge right now. I love telemetry. It is really cool because it allows us to do habitat work, to follow the fish and do habitat around that fish, availability and location use get at selection. But we also get this kind of data. In green is river miles on this axis here, date on the x-axis. The gray is the data storage tag that's in the fish, which is recording depth. In red is the data storage tag in the fish, which is recording body temperature or water temperature. And in blue is the discharge on the nearest gauge. The hypothesis is that the relationship between the migratory and spawning behavior and either the temperature or the discharge wiggly line, and the challenge is really taking multiple wiggly lines and statistically demonstrating what that response is. This migratory response is one that we are now associating with successful pallisergent spawning. This fish was captured just after the apex of its migration and was found to have dropped its eggs. And we were able to trace this fish into an area about twice the size of this room, which is pretty darn high resolution from the Missouri River. But it's very hard to take a look at this and say that any part of this migratory process related to one of these bumps in the map, or in the discharge here. We do see a very characteristic change in the depth use. While it's migrating, it's using lots and lots of depths. But when it gets to the apex of its migration, it settles down and uses depths very little variability. It helps us validate that spawning is happening at that point. This was a successful spawner. This was an unsuccessful spawner. And we've had a couple of these that are starting to give us a pattern. You see how the migration started up and then stopped. And that stop of migration was coincident with a rapid decrease in temperature. This rapid decrease in temperature was not associated with discharge. This isn't the situation where water coming out of the dam is cold and the fish reacts to it. This was a high pressure system with cold air coming in from Canada. Resumed its migration, another steep temperature change, and the fish went into sort of a strange oscillation, recaptured here in Lake Bay, and her eggs had gone atritic. She did not spawn. So we're starting to get an idea that there's a relationship between spawning behavior and temperature, not seen much in discharge, and the temperature is not related always to what's coming out of the dam. A lot of it is related to climatic conditions and meteorological conditions. This is just a summary of the data. We're tracking a lot of fish. We're only tracking a handful of reproductive fish in every year. And here's the fish we've been tracking in those years. This is the upstream part. This is the downstream part. And what I've shown colored here are years when we've had flow pulses. And the magnitude of those flow pulses, this is in thousands of CFS. And in blue, these are the managed flow pulses out of the dam. So there's some years we had no flow pulses in the upper part of the river system. And this is when we've been able to demonstrate the spawning occurred. Happening with flow pulses downstream, but we almost always have flow pulses downstream. Happening without flow pulses, either natural or managed ones upstream. It did happen in 1 year with a managed flow pulse, and again without a flow pulse. And the 2011 data, the 2011 data are off the chart because we had a huge flow. This is not statistically valid at this point, but strong evidence that the primary premise that these fish are going to be recovered by altering the flow regime is incorrect. And it's, a point of information. We're continuing this. And we think that and the question about when is this good enough to say you should stop manipulating the flow regime for pallet sturgeon becomes one of these stakeholder questions. When are the agencies, when are the stakeholders happy enough with this? Are they going to look for statistical rigor, or is this enough of a story at this point? I can't answer the question. We don't know. But we're going to be continuing this for a number of years and see whether we continue to get spawning without this flow pulse. So that deals with how the flow regime affects the spawning queue sort of area. I want to talk a little bit about the low flow. Remember the coordinator said we don't have to use the low flow. We don't have to manipulate the flow regime for this low flow. Instead, we're going to create a lot of this shallow water habitat. This is part of what I talked about this morning. Millions of dollars have been spent on shallow water habitat. And here's the guiding principle here. River map was published in 1894, but mapped about 1879. Here, Herman, Missouri. A lot of complexity, a very wide channel. This is what it looks like today with the navigation channel. Each one of these is a rock wing dike or navigation structure. This is bedrock on this bank, but on this bank, behind each one of these structures is rock revetment. So this has been channelized and kept in place in order to maintain that navigation channel. There's another paper, and I have a reading list if people are interested in this, where we looked at sensitivity of that shallow water habitat to flow regime. Trying to get at that, how flow regime and channel morphology work together to determine habitat potential in this river. Our methodology is two-dimensional hydraulic modeling, and we did a very brazen sort of thing. We did a very well constrained, calibrated, and validated model under current conditions. And then we created a virtual 1894 river, which has the benefit of nobody can tell you that you have to validate it better than you can. And in some ways it may be wrong, but of course all models are wrong. Some are useful, as George Fox would say. And we think it gave us some real insights into the interaction between flow regime and channel morphology. We essentially took the calibration parameters from today and moved them to 1894. And what we're looking at as a response variable goes back to the biological thing, is the shallow water habitat, 0 to 5 foot deep, 0 to 1.5 feet per second. Tremendous emphasis on that. It may be the wrong variable, and I'll get into that in a minute, but it probably is indicative of lost habitat because of the way the river's been managed. In addition to the work at Herman, we had a variety of other places along the river where we did these two-dimensional hydraulic models under modern-day conditions. And they all showed this sort of form. On the x-axis here, I've got the normalized discharge, because we worked at different places along the river, so we took the discharge normalized by the median discharge in that part of the river system so we could compare these. So when you get up to about over 2 times the median discharge, you're just starting to get up over bank. So these are all within the channel. And they all show this form, that there's very little of the shallow water habitat until you get to low discharges. And the significance of this is that these discharges that maximize habitat under the current condition are insufficient to float a barge. So this is a conundrum that the service and the Corps have been faced with. Our virtual river showed a lot more habitat and the opposite relationship to discharge. Because instead of having a channelized system, you had lots of levels, more habitat complexity, topographic complexity, and as the discharge went up, you maintained more of that shallow water habitat all the way up into the floodplain or riparian zone. That doesn't exist today. And then I have a blue line on there, which is this part of the river, which includes a side channel chute, a restoration project there, a restoration project here. And that blue line shows that in a rehabilitated reach of the river, we use rehabilitated this time, synonymous with restoration for the time being. But in this part of the river that's been gone through a rehabilitation process, there is more of that shallow water habitat, and it's relatively insensitive to discharge variability, suggesting that there is a potential common ground in restoration where you can put back some of this complexity and also have this other use of the main use of the river, which is the navigation. Contingent, of course, the idea that the shallow water habitat unit actually has some ecological and biological meaning. One other way to look at this, I took the median flow for the river that we modeled in 2000 under the regulated hydrograph, and this is the median amount of that shallow water habitat over the year. So here's what it's like now. And I said, what if I had a completely natural hydrograph? This is the increase, in some places decrease, of habitat and variability if it was a completely natural hydrograph. Not much change at all. On the other hand, if we had the 1894 channel and a completely regulated hydrograph, there is a lot of this habitat during the entire year. And that's just because the morphology of the river is an overwhelming effect. And then if you take our best understanding of how the river worked naturally with the natural channel morphology and the natural hydrograph, this is the curve we would get. And 2 things I want to point out to you. The channel morphology can move the amount of habitat up quite a bit, but the flow regime is the only way you're going to get events. And that brings us to the point of understanding that it's not just morphology in terms of total habitat availability, but habitat availability events may be important. And under the natural flow regime and the natural channel morphology, there's also more variability during the year. The moving littoral, the flood pulse moving up into the floodplain and back out again. So that there's a different disturbance regime for those kinds of habitats and perhaps different utilization. So it's not that the flow regime isn't important. It is that under the current conditions, the effect is much less than the channel morphology. But if you put them both back together, they have an interaction that might be what's really missing from the system. And almost finally, I don't expect you to read this graph. This is just to tell you we did a lot of work with the habitat mapping and the telemetry to see what habitats the adult sturgeon were using. So we could look at use and availability and calculate selectivity coefficients and find out were adult pellet sturgeon actually using the shallow water habitat.
They do not. It would have been really convenient if they had, because then we could say, okay, we know that at least adults are using this habitat, therefore it must be a good thing. But they don't. They like deeper parts of the river, and they like faster parts of the river. So if shallow water habitat is important, it's not an adult sturgeon, it's probably through refugium for early life stages, like I was discussing this morning, or food supply. And this is an inconvenient thing because documentation of age 0 occupancy and the food web leakages are exceedingly, not possible as you know, but much more difficult than what we've been doing so far. And just to show you an example of that, we've started to work on this. So we can start to characterize habitats of the river at this scale. This is our multi-beam imagery. And working with our colleagues at the Fish and Wildlife Service, they've done a bunch of benthic trawls in this area, shallow water habitat area. Lots and lots of zeros in this data set because this is what they're trying to catch. They're very small, and this is a very, very large river. And that's the challenge of trying to make this case for the function of shallow water habitat in this species. So, in terms of general restoration strategies, the Missouri River is really focused on the natural flow regime. It definitely controls the sequence, magnitude, timing of environmental cues and life stage events. We know that, and that's really well established in ecological literature. But whether it affects the pallid sturgeon or not, we're not sure if that can be inferred. When you naturalize the flow regime, it affects all parts of the river downstream from there. In the Missouri River and most western rivers, it comes at tremendous political cost. But this was the first thing the Fish and Wildlife Service wanted to do. And it cost them a lot politically and slowed down a lot of the restoration. It's not supported by our existing sturgeon science, although of course that might change as we get more. Re-engineering the channel form, on the other hand, is a very effective increasing habitat availability, the diversity of habitat, and the effectiveness of flow events. But it affects short segments of the river. So you have to do it in a lot of places, and it costs money. It's been very, can I put this in here? I took it out. It's been much more acceptable socially than this has been, because the federal government is spending money. Some landowners are getting are having to sell land or being able to sell land to the government. But it's gone over a lot better politically than a lot of this has done. The functions and linkages of shallow water habitat, the sturgeon reproduction and survival, are difficult and have not yet been defined. That's a big challenge. Because the sediment budget of the river is less than or equal to 17% of what it was naturally, this might be a limiting factor on how much of that shallow water habitat could actually be formed. Because you can only create so much accommodation space on the river. You can't expect sandbars and reflexi to form if you don't have sediment in order to do that. And between these two, we're still working on trying to figure out what that social and political optimum is. The sustainability initiative, I think it's reasonable to ask the question, is this all sustainable? There are issues about like physical sustainability, which are engineering issues that we're working on. This was not sustainable. It filled in the sediment immediately. These lasted about a year and a half. A lot of these side channel chutes are sustainable if they're engineered correctly. But I think one of the bigger questions is whether the funding that's been spent on this river is sustainable. These are really big numbers. And we've been very, and this isn't all science. In fact, very little. 10 to 15% of this is science, okay? The rest of it is land acquisition, lots and lots of engineering costs associated with this. This is over $500 million that's been spent since 2004. And one of the sustainability questions I have is whether the American taxpayer will sustain this kind of investment. Now, at some point, as this is done and the river is de-engineered, it may end up in a sustainable fashion, but we're pretty far away from that right now. And to get to that guiding image of the 20 to 30 acres per mile, plus a self-sustaining recovered pallid sturgeon population, plus a self-sustaining recovered tern plover population, we've got a long way to go. So in summary, I think that understanding river geography is very important. I hope I've demonstrated this here. You have to understand why the river is different in different places. It gives you different opportunities. History is important because it diminishes some options and helps out in some of the options. In the engineering side of things, these engineered solutions, essentially the design of ecosystems, unfortunately require a lot more understanding and information. If you're on the other side, it's a holistic restoration, and you're working in a basin that's small enough, you pull out all the dams, take humans out of the picture, and walk away from it. You don't need a lot of information to do that and justify it. And when you get into these highly engineered systems, where there's a lot of people trying to get a lot of other value out of the system, information science becomes a lot more important to make sure you're getting it at the right thing. And as I made the point this morning, the social political context is really huge in doing this kind of science. And that's why we're ending up with all this work that's been done on shallow water habitat and not really knowing at this point, after hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent, about whether it's all that effective. So, thank you. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I went a little bit over, but I got enthusiastic. I have nothing to do until my flight tomorrow morning, so if there are questions, I'll be very happy to answer.
We should take a few of the open audience, and then, like you said, I think we're going to get moved out of here in 15 minutes, 20 minutes or so. Any questions?
Yes.
Is there any money going into alternative hypotheses? And if not, when are you going to work mission on shallow water habitat?
So some of the alternative hypotheses that are out there are ones that come up sort of as these ancillary projects that come up. We will propose lots of stuff, and a lot of times, well, no, this is about biological opinion of science. These are the things we can work with. But then we have other funding sources, internal USGS money, et cetera. So we are able to address some of them. One of the more interesting ones is that about 18% of the shovel-nosed sturgeon in this river are intersex. So they're endocrine disruptors in the system. And most of these are feminized males. So there's questions about the role of contaminants. Now, so I had that diagram up there with all the different stressors, and contaminants is one of them. Contaminants is listed as a threat in the listing document for the pallet sturgeon. The Corps of Engineers is not responsible for recovering the pallet sturgeon. They're just responsible for removing the jeopardy opinion. And so that's where they emphasize things. And so we've had other funding sources look at the contaminant issue, and that is working for as an alternative hypothesis. We have also hypotheses about the genetic structuring that we might have runs of these fish and stocking plans. The natural distribution, the stocking plans may not be interacting the way they should be, so the fish are not, in a sense, reacting well to that. We may be stocking the wrong genetic stocks in the wrong places. So there's some work that's being done on that as well. The big hypothesis right now is we haven't taken care of the spawning, but we've made a lot of progress on that. And so we've gone down to, okay, how does shallow water habitat operate? And there is effort to do more water quality work in those areas. As I was talking about this morning, there is effort to look at primary productivity, although this is not a phytoplankton limited system. There's a lot of primary productivity in the system already. But other questions like, is there a relation to crayfish populations? There's another hypothesis, a little bit of effort on that right now. Have we extirpated their crayfish, which maybe is an energetic thing? We did it, we worked on the hypothesis of maybe they can't migrate effectively upstream through this high velocity river because over the wide and shallow, the velocities were quite a bit slower. But what we found was that they really optimize what's there, and the pathways that they use are very similar to the pathways that they use on the Yellowstone River, which is our natural analog, suggesting that migration pathways and the energetics probably are a problem. We're still looking at the food part of that. But that doesn't get the bulk of the attention. And that's because it's about getting the jeopardy opinion removed rather than addressing those alternative hypotheses. Yeah.
You had the harvest stock from back before. Was there age distribution information on the sturgeons associated with that older harvest data?
Yeah.
And how do the cohorts now compare, or do they have reproductive cohorts every year, or were they pulse? I mean, they're fairly long-lived species.
Yeah, yeah. That was commercial harvest, and that was dominated by drum and catfish. I don't think maybe there was some shovelnose sturgeon in there. And before the talent was listed, there were probably some talents in there too, but we don't know anything about harvest. Well, we know very little about harvest of talents in terms of numbers or tonnage. These fish are long-lived. The ones that are up at the Yellowstone confluence are 60 to 80 years old. They don't spawn until they're about 13 years old. And then the conventional wisdom was that they spawn every 3 to 5 years. But now that we have some of the fish in our database, we've been tracking for multiple years, we're finding some of the males are cycling every year, and some of the females are cycling every 2 years. So we're getting some of that data together, and some other scientists are working on population viability models to try to take some of that survival information and growth information and try to get at this question.
You mentioned sort of in the beginning of the presentation how both local and global drivers can be affecting what you're doing with the restoration, so soybean prices in Brazil or something like that. What I want to know is if there's been any attempt to sort of work towards restoration outside of the river, like say buying out navigation on the river and creating alternative transportation mechanisms terrestrially that may take that navigation stakeholder out of the equation and allow certain restoration activities that were kind of prevented by that stakeholder previously.
Yeah. There have been some efforts at that, including, I talked this morning about an NRC report that came out in 2011. There was one that came out in 2000, which was generally about adaptive management of the Missouri River. And this is that outside expert, their role, and they come in and they can think outside the box. They don't care what the Corps' authority is. And there's a resource economist on that from the University of Colorado who got some ideas into that report that were very controversial, such as you should just redesign all the barges on the river so they can actually float at lower discharges. You should do incremental cost analysis and say, why do you have navigation all the way up to Sioux City? Maybe it's really only economically effective up to these sort of ideas, including buying out the industry. There's about 5 firms. I get the boat report every day on email, and if there's 3 tows on the river, that's a really heavy day. That's very, very different from the Mississippi River. Mississippi River navigation is a very, very viable alternative. Some of the discussions that come up are these flows on the Missouri River, they float barges on the Missouri, but they're also important to maintain navigation on the middle Mississippi down to where the Ohio comes in. And then there's also an idea that they call navigation-compelled rail rates. And that argument is that as long as there's one towboat on the river, railroad rates will be kept low. But as soon as navigation goes away, railroad rates for all these commodities will expand quite a lot. And so that's one of the favorite arguments. And I'm not in a position to be able to, to judge those very well. But there are people who are starting to look at that off and on. It takes, however, some sort of event for something like that to happen. And it would take, maybe another NRC committee or, literally an act of Congress. And that's when I talked in that big, long, complicated slide, Mr. Raff's, the Missouri River Authorized Purposes Study that lasted for about a year before it was killed by the downstream states. That was an attempt to really look at, should we still be authorizing navigation? Should we still be authorizing other things on the river system? But that was killed very quickly. So things that people are thinking about it, but not a whole lot of progress on that. But I think one of the things that shows is that of all the uses of the river, navigation has the biggest effect on the hydrograph. Yes?
Just had a quick question, I guess I don't know. Are there even carp in this watershed at all? Or?
Yep. Talked about that a little bit this morning, and that's one of the bad, one of the part of the balance here is that the shallow water habitat creates that slow water that is perfect Asian carp habitat.
Okay. Yeah,
and so
that's what we're restoring the river for, invasive species or
But here's the thing. The definition of shallow, slow water is really good for Asian carp, but what actually gets constructed, because the engineers aren't all that precise in what they do, is faster than that. And Asian carp don't actually like the faster water that now we understand really is selected by Allen sturgeon. So now there's a reason to redesign and redefine shallow water habitat, and it could exclude some of that with slower velocities that are so beneficial to the Asian carp.
I think we should give a big hand and